Welcome to CSS Breakdown, Book by Book, Season 6, Episode 34, where we embark on a profound journey through Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern British History, 4th edition, to explore the dramatic and multifaceted end of the British Empire. Imagine this, it's 1946. The British Empire, well, it's still largely intact. You've got troops stationed all over the globe. Germany, Greece, Iran, India, Egypt, Palestine, Malaya, Singapore.
Yeah, it really was that empire on which the sun never set, wasn't it? An incredible sprawl.
Absolutely. But then, astonishingly, within just a few decades, almost all of it vanishes.
Yeah.
Gone.
It's a truly remarkable transformation, and what's really striking, I think, is that the end of this huge empire wasn't, a single event. It wasn't some carefully planned exit strategy.
No.
No, not at all. It was actually a really complex, often contradictory process. It was shaped by all sorts of pressures, both inside Britain and, crucially, out in the colonies themselves.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Our mission today is to dig into those key forces, the ones that led to this dramatic shift. We'll dive into the specific stories, how Britain pulled out of some of its most important possessions. And hopefully by the end of this deep dive, you'll have a much clearer picture, not just of what happened, but why it happened, and the kind of impact it left behind.
Sounds good. It's a huge topic.
It is. So before we get to the end, let's just quickly grasp the sheer scale of the empire at its peak. We're talking maybe just before World War I.
Arguably, yes. That's often seen as the high water mark.
And the numbers are just staggering, covering a fifth of the world's land surface, over 400 million people. I mean, what was it all for? What drove this massive expansion?
Well, the motives were really varied, often tangled together. Economically, sure, it was fundamentally about raw materials, finding new markets for British goods.
Standard economic drivers.
Right. But interestingly, it often didn't start with wanting political control. That often came later, when trading interests felt threatened. India is a classic example of that escalation.
Oh, right.
Which is why Bernard Porter famously called the British absent-minded imperialists. It wasn't always this grand, deliberate plan.
Right. Sort of stumbled into it sometimes?
In a way, yes. Then layered on top of that, you had this powerful ideology, the idea of civilizing the natives. Basically, bringing British attitudes, British values, which was often framed as a kind of duty.
A moral justification.
You have figures like Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India, calling it the greatest empire for good that the world has seen. Quite a statement.
Wow.
And let's not forget, it was also a practical thing, a training ground for Britain's upper-class administrators and military officers. Gave them purpose, instilled a sense of duty.
So fast forward back to 1946. The empire is still huge, but you mentioned strains. Were the cracks starting to show? Was maintaining this global presence becoming, difficult?
Precisely. That's the key tension. On the map, it looks formidable. But the actual resources needed, maintaining that worldwide military footprint, it was pushing post-war Britain, which was financially exhausted, right to its limit.
Okay.
And you could see that strain even within the Labour cabinet. Figures like Hugh Dalton, the Chancellor, were really anxious about the cost, pushing for savings, for economizing.
So even as India, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, now and Burma got independence in 47-48 under Labour, that wasn't necessarily the start of a grand dismantling plan.
Exactly. That's a crucial distinction. Those specific cases had their own momentum, but it didn't signal a government-wide policy of immediate total decolonization.
That's fascinating. So they weren't just packing up everywhere.
Not at all. In fact, the Labour government from 45 to 51 largely intended to maintain the empire, even develop it economically. They saw it as absolutely vital.
Vital. How so?
For strengthening the sterling area, that group of countries using the pound or pegged to it, Britain acted as the banker, basically. And they needed to earn dollars, hard currency, by selling colonial raw materials. Think rubber from Malaya, cocoa from the Gold Coast.
The economic engine aspect.
Right. They even set up the Colonial Development Corporation in 1948, hired hundreds of new staff for the colonial office. It was quite an effort. Some historians even provocatively call it a second colonial occupation.
The second occupation. Wow.
Yeah, the idea being this renewed push for economic extraction and development. Plus, there was the Cold War context wanting to prevent communism spreading, especially in places like Malaya.
Okay.
But, and this is a big but, by the early 1950s, many of these grand development schemes, like that big East African groundnut scheme, well, they were failing spectacularly in some cases.
Right, I've heard of that one.
Yeah.
Bit of a disaster.
A huge white elephant. And what it really underlined was the harsh economic reality. Even with good intentions, the sheer financial strain and, frankly, the diminishing returns of running an empire after World War II were becoming undeniable.
That context really sets the stage then for the rapid decolonization that kicks off, particularly late 50s, early 60s. Given how diverse the empire was there one single cause for it speeding up like that? Or was it more complex?
Oh, it was almost always a combination of things, a mix of push and pull factors, really. A key driver, no doubt, was the surge in nationalist movements within the colonies.
Gaining strength.
Absolutely. Often emboldened by Britain's wartime losses, especially to the Japanese, seeing places like Singapore fall really shattered that myth of British invincibility.
Makes sense.
And some historians argue that those very economic policies of the second colonial occupation, the ones meant to squeeze more value out, they actually ended up antagonizing local populations even more, ironically speeding up the empire's end.
So trying to hold on tighter actually loosened the grip.
In some ways, yes. As Graham Goodlad put it, policies designed to strengthen the empire may have paradoxically helped end it.
And meanwhile, Britain itself was struggling economically, right? Defending this massive, far-flung thing must have been incredibly expensive.
Hugely expensive, especially when they were also trying to develop their own nuclear weapons, which was a massive drain. And they desperately wanted to avoid getting bogged down in long, costly colonial wars like the French were experiencing in Algeria. The prospect was just exhausting.
Yeah, you can imagine.
And then you layer on the external pressures. The whole world order was shifting. You had the USA and the USSR now as the superpowers, and both were, broadly speaking, hostile to the old European empires.
Hostile in different ways, I assume.
Right. The Americans wanted access to those imperially protected markets. They saw the empire as blocking free trade, essentially. That really came to a head during the Suez Crisis in '56.
Ah, Suez. A pivotal moment.
Definitely. The U.S. refused to back Britain financially, and it was a massive humiliation. It exposed Britain's weakness on the world stage and arguably gave a huge boost to independence movements everywhere.
In the Soviets.
Well, for them, imperialism was an evil of capitalism. Simple as that, ideologically. Plus, there was a real fear in Britain that long colonial wars might even provoke Soviet intervention.
So pressure from both superpowers.
And just general world opinion was shifting. By 1960, you had lots of newly independent states like India and Pakistan active in the UN condemning colonialism. It became a matter of international respectability. How could the West criticize the Soviets in Eastern Europe while clinging to their own empires?
A difficult position.
Very. So despite some grumbling from, right-wing conservatives like Enoch Powell, who apparently walked the streets trying to process India's independence back in '47, most people in Britain gradually came to accept decolonization as, well, inevitable.
Just the way things were going.
Pretty much. And leaders like Macmillan and his colonial secretary Ian MacLeod, they hoped the former colonies would join the Commonwealth. Keep some links, trade, influence.
Maintain a connection.
Exactly. As Graham Goodlad summed it up, decolonization became a realistic response when Britain's room for maneuver was just getting smaller and smaller.
Let's zoom in on India then, the jewel in the crown. Its independence in 1947 really feels like the watershed moment, the start of the big withdrawal. Why India, and why then?
Well, the nationalist movement in India had been building for decades.
Yep.
By 1945, after the war, independence felt pretty much unavoidable. But why Britain left exactly then? That's where the debate gets lively among historians.
Okay, what are the main lines of argument?
On one side, you have the official British narrative, often presented at the time. This framed it as the sort of natural, planned culmination of British policy, a triumph of British planning and statesmanship, as V.P. Menon, an Indian advisor, actually put it.
A positive spin, then.
Very much so. Menon even called Britain's decision to leave her finest hour, a sort of benevolent handover.
But I'm guessing not everyone saw it that way, particularly Indian historians.
Not at all. Historians like Sumit Sarkar and Anita Indersingh argue pretty forcefully that independence was never the long-term British goal. They say earlier reforms were designed to postpone independence, not prepare for it.
So they give the credit elsewhere.
Entirely. They credit the Indian National Congress, this huge mass movement, for basically forcing Britain's hand through decades of struggle negotiation, yes, but also mass civil disobedience, a protracted trial of strength.
So is one not given?
That's their perspective. Independence was the hard-won fruit of struggle and sacrifice. They argue Labour's offer in March 1946 only came because things inside India were becoming ungovernable, agrarian unrest, demands for overthrow, even mutinies in the Indian military.
The pressure was just too much.
Sure.
Exactly. And economically, India, which used to be profitable, was now a major drain on Britain's finances. It actually held Britain's largest sterling balances on the heart. Britain owed India money. As George L. Bernstein pointed out, the real question for Britain became how to get out while keeping India in the Commonwealth and the sterling area.
And then alongside all this, there was the incredibly tragic issue of partition. Why couldn't India stay united?
That's the heartbreaking part. The core issue was the deep and escalating hostility between Hindus and Muslims. The Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, became utterly convinced that an independent India would be dominated by the Hindu majority.
So they demanded separation.
Yes, they demanded a separate Muslim state, Pakistan. There were attempts at compromise, maybe a federal structure with strong regional autonomy for Muslim areas, but they just couldn't agree on the details. The mistrust was too deep by then.
And things turned violent.
Terribly violent. In August 1946, the viceroy, Lord Wavell, invited Nehru, the Congress leader, to form an interim government. Jinnah reacted by calling for direct action. This sparked horrific riots in Calcutta, maybe 5,000 people killed.
Oh my goodness.
And that violence just spread like wildfire. The country was really teetering on the edge of full-blown civil war.
So faced with this absolute chaos, how did the British actually carry out the partition? What was the process?
Well, Prime Minister Attlee announced Britain would leave by June 1948. He appointed a new viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, basically to oversee the withdrawal.
And Mountbatten made a quick decision.
Very quick. He arrived, assessed the situation, and concluded partition was the only way to avoid an even bigger civil war. He figured bloodshed was probably inevitable either way, but maybe less if they partition than if they tried to force unity.
A grim calculation.
Indeed. He rushed a plan together in just 6 weeks. Nehru and Jinnah accepted it, though Gandhi, importantly, did not. Then, fearing more delays would just make things worse, Mountbatten controversially brought the withdrawal date forward all the way to August 1947, much sooner than planned.
Wow, just like that. So the Indian Independence Act gets rushed through Parliament, separating out Pakistan into two chunks, thousands of miles apart. But that speed, it had devastating consequences, didn't it?
Devastating is the word. The real problem was splitting provinces like Punjab and Bengal, which had large mixed populations of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. Millions suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of a border drawn almost overnight on a map.
And they tried to move.
Massive migration started, driven by fear of persecution. And this led to just horrific mob violence, particularly in the Punjab. Estimates vary, but maybe a 250,000 people were murdered in the chaos. Just unimaginable brutality.
Unbelievable.
Gandhi managed to calm things in Bengal through his nonviolent presence, a testament to his influence. But then, tragically, he himself was assassinated in January 1948 by a Hindu fanatic.
So much tragedy. How did Britain respond to the accusations of blame for the violence?
Attlee firmly insisted Britain wasn't to blame. He put it down to the failure of the Indians to agree among themselves. Historians still debate this intensely.
I can imagine.
Some, like Howard Brasted, suggest maybe a less sensitive British approach could have been even worse and point to the transfer of power itself being relatively peaceful at the state level. But others, like A.N. Wilson, are incredibly critical of Mountbatten. Wilson blames his superficial haste, his sheer arrogance, and his inattention to vital detail for causing death on a scale comparable to war criminals. A very harsh judgment.
A really complex and contested legacy there. Now, India was huge, but Britain had other tough spots. What about Palestine? That was another mandate territory, right?
Yes, Palestine was a British mandate since 1919, and the problems there really started after World War I with significant Jewish immigration aiming for that national home. This was fiercely opposed by the existing Arab population.
And World War II made things worse.
Much worse. You had hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees fleeing Hitler's Europe, desperate for sanctuary. The U.S., especially President Truman, put enormous pressure on Britain to let 100,000 refugees into Palestine immediately.
But Britain refused. Why?
They refused, mainly because they wanted to maintain good relations with Arab states, crucial for oil supplies. And frankly, They felt Truman was being hypocritical. He wasn't offering to take more refugees into the U.S. or provide significant help. It was seen as pressure without responsibility.
So the Jewish community felt they had to fight.
Yes, many felt they had no other choice. Jewish underground groups began a campaign of violence, sometimes called terrorism, against both Arabs and the British forces. The bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem in 1946, the British headquarters, was a particularly shocking event.
What did Britain do then, caught between these forces?
The Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, tried hard to find a compromise, but neither side would yield an inch. Jews wanted their state. Arabs refused any partition. So by February 1947, Britain basically washed its hands of it and handed the problem over to the United Nations.
And the UN voted for partition.
They did, but Bevin and the British government opposed implementing it. They argued it was fundamentally unfair to force Palestinian Arabs into becoming a minority in a new Jewish state, especially when Jews refused to be a minority in an Arab one. So Britain refused to enforce the UN plan and just withdrew completely in May 1948, ending the mandate.
And the moment they left.
The moment they left, fighting erupted. The State of Israel was declared, and neighboring Arab states immediately attacked. Israel won that war, but the result was nearly 1 million Palestinian Arabs becoming refugees, the start of a conflict that continues today.
Who gets the blame for that outcome? Still debated.
Fiercely. At the time, many, including British conservatives, blamed the Labour government for mishandling it. Arabs accused Britain of favoring the Jews. Jews accused Britain of favoring the Arabs. Bevin himself blamed the U.S. Truman's pressure, rejecting compromises, pushing the UN partition plan, which Bevin felt guaranteed violence.
But defenders of Britain's actions.
They argue it was an impossible situation, no way to satisfy both sides, and withdrawal, however messy, did save Britain a fortune, over 100 million spent and 80,000 troops tied down there since 1945.
Let's switch focus again to Malaya. Economically vital for Britain, you mentioned rubber. How did withdrawal work there, especially the communist insurgents active?
Malaya was complex, too. A multiracial society, Malays, Chinese, Indians, and different states. After the Japanese occupation, Chinese communist guerrillas, who'd actually fought the Japanese alongside the Allies, turned against British rule. This led to the Malayan Emergency, declared in 1948.
So Britain fought them.
Yes, quite successfully. They used effective counterinsurgency tactics, including resettling rural populations to deny the guerrillas support. But crucially, they also made a promise. Independence would come once the country was ready.
Offering a political solution, too.
Exactly. And that kept the Malay majority largely pro-British. Then, in 1955, a multiracial party, the Alliance Party led by Tunku Abdul Rahman, emerged, providing a credible path to self-government. Malaya got full independence in 1957 and joined the Commonwealth.
And later formed Malaysia.
Right. In 1963, Malaya joined with Singapore, Sarawak, and North Borneo to form Malaysia, partly to ensure a continued Malay majority in the new federation, though Brunei opted out and Singapore later separated in 1965.
Okay, one more complex case before Africa. Cyprus. Strategically important, but sounds like it was even trickier.
It really was, primarily because of the split population. Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. The Greek Cypriots overwhelmingly wanted a no-cis union with Greece. The Turkish Cypriots vehemently opposed this, fearing for their minority rights.
And Britain's position.
Initially, under Eden, who succeeded Churchill, it was hardline. Cyprus must remain British permanently because it was a vital military base, especially after losing the Suez Canal Zone base. They even rejected Greek offers that would have allowed Britain to keep bases even with enosis.
Which led to conflict.
It did. The Greek Cypriot nationalist group, EOK, launched a guerrilla campaign against the British. Britain responded with a state of emergency in 1955, arrests, deportations. It got nasty.
So how did Macmillan handle it when he took over in '57?
Macmillan was more pragmatic. He favored compromise, especially as the Turkish Cypriots started forming their own armed groups, raising the specter of full-blown civil war between the communities.
A dangerous situation.
Very. He appointed a more sympathetic governor, Sir Hugh Foot, who managed to broker a deal. Archbishop Makarios, the Greek Cypriot leader, agreed to drop enosis. In return, Cyprus got full independence in 1960.
And the Turkish minority.
Their interests were specifically protected in the constitution, and crucially, Britain got to keep 2 large military bases. It looked like a diplomatic triumph at the time.
But it didn't last.
Sadly, no. The complex power-sharing arrangements broke down by 1963. Leading to intercommunal violence, UN intervention, and eventually Turkey's military intervention in 1974, which divided the island, a division that persists to this day.
Such difficult legacies. Let's move now to Africa. The pace of change there in the late 50s and 60s seems incredibly fast. What drove the rapid dissolution of the empire across Africa?
Well, again, there's that debate among historians. How much was it driven by local African nationalism and how much by factors back in Britain, the metropolitan factors?
Okay.
Some historians, like Robert Holland, emphasize the British side. They argue colonial powers basically decided empires didn't fit their modern foreign policy or economic goals anymore. It was a strategic shift away from empire.
Or divesting.
Right. But others give much more weight to the sheer force of African nationalism itself. It spread incredibly quickly after 1945. You had more educated Africans who'd experienced racial discrimination, maybe studied abroad, and came back with a burning sense of injustice, seeing colonialism as exploitation and humiliation.
And that ties into Macmillan's Wind of Change speech in 1960. Was that just recognizing the inevitable?
I think it was exactly that. He delivered it in Cape Town, of all places, right in the heart of white minority rule. He said, quite bluntly, "Whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact, and our national policies must take account of it."
Clear signal.
Absolutely. Britain was economically weaker, couldn't afford costly wars, especially while pouring money into nuclear weapons. Macmillan himself, as chancellor before becoming PM, had apparently done cost-benefit analyses, profit and loss accounts for colonies, and concluded withdrawal was the dignified, realistic way forward.
While hoping to keep influence through other means.
Yes, through trade, aid, and the Commonwealth. Trying to transition from formal empire to informal influence, what some critics call neocolonialism.
Let's look at West Africa first. The sources say that was relatively straightforward.
Comparatively, yes. Places like the Gold Coast, Ghana in 57, Nigeria 60, Sierra Leone 61, the Gambia 65. The key difference there was fewer European settlers. Mostly administrators, not people with huge farms or businesses they felt they had to defend to the death.
So less entrenched opposition.
Much less. Ghana's independence, led by Kwame Nkrumah, happened fairly smoothly. There were strikes and boycotts earlier, but the British recognized Nkrumah's mass support and moved towards independence relatively quickly. Nigeria was bigger, more complex, huge regional and tribal divides, but they managed to set up a federal system for independence in 1960.
Though, sadly, that didn't prevent later conflict.
No, tragically, those divisions led to the Biafran War just a few years later in 1967, a terrible civil war.
East Africa, though, that was different. You had the settler factor, especially in Kenya.
Exactly. Tanganyika, Tanzania 61, and Uganda 62 achieved independence with black majority rule without too much upheaval. Leaders like Julius Nyerere in Tanganyika did a lot to reassure white residents. But Kenya was much, much harder.
Because of the white settlers.
Yes. Around 66,000 of them. Many were deeply opposed, often violently, to the idea of black majority rule. They refused to negotiate seriously with Jomo Kenyatta and his Kenya African Unity Party. Some settlers seemed to hope violence would actually destroy the African political movement.
And this led to the Mau Mau uprising.
It did. African frustration, particularly among the Kikuyu tribe who felt their land had been stolen, erupted into the Mau Mau attacks, often targeting other Africans seen as collaborators, but also settlers. Britain declared a state of emergency in 1952.
And the British response was brutal.
Shockingly brutal. Kenyatta himself, despite publicly condemning terrorism, was arrested and jailed for 6 years. Britain poured in troops 100,000 at the peak. Over the next 8 years, thousands were killed, overwhelmingly Africans, and over 100,000 Kikuyu were detained in camps.
Camps? What were conditions like?
Appalling. Described later as concentration camp conditions. The Hola Camp scandal in 1959, where prisoners were beaten to death, exposed some of it, but later research by historians like David Anderson and Caroline Elkins revealed the full horror.
What did they uncover?
Things like over 1,000 Kikuyu hanged after summary trials, maybe 20,000 killed in the fighting, and possibly up to 100,000 dying in the detention camps from brutality, disease, neglect. Systematic beatings, torture, killings were apparently routine. It's a truly dark chapter. By contrast, fewer than 100 white civilians were killed by Mau Mau.
Just staggering numbers. Yet despite crushing the uprising so brutally, Britain then did a complete U-turn by 1960. How did that happen?
It seems extraordinary, doesn't it? But yes, partly the wind of change factor, the general move towards decolonization, partly the sheer cost and the bad international publicity of the repression, especially after Hola. And eventually, they realized Kenyatta, the man they jailed, was actually a relative moderate who could potentially lead a stable Kenya.
So they released him?
Yes, eventually, and allowed him to become prime minister when Kenya got independence in 1963. And remarkably, Despite everything he'd endured, Kenyatta pursued a policy of reconciliation. White settlers who chose to stay were generally treated fairly.
Amazing. Finally, Central Africa. Possibly the toughest case because the white settler population, especially in Southern Rhodesia, was even more entrenched.
That's right. They were so alarmed by rising African nationalism that in 1953, whites in Southern Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia, and Nyasaland formed the Central African Federation. The explicit aim was to preserve white minority rule indefinitely.
But African leaders opposed this.
Fiercely. Leaders like Dr. Hastings Banda in Nyasaland, Kenneth Kaunda in Northern Rhodesia, and Joshua Nkomo in Southern Rhodesia campaigned relentlessly for black majority rule, often leading to unrest and violence.
Was there support in Britain for the African cause?
Yes, significant support. Public opinion and political pressure mounted. The British government set up the Monckton Commission to investigate. It recommended giving Africans the vote and, crucially, allowing territories to leave the Federation if they wished.
Which they did.
Yes. Nyasaland became independent Malaya in 1964, and Northern Rhodesia became independent Zambia in the same year, both relatively smoothly under African majority rule.
But Southern Rhodesia, that was different. Became just Rhodesia after the Federation broke up. Why did it take until 1980?
Because the white settlers there, led by Ian Smith, absolutely refused to concede power. When Britain insisted on progress towards black majority rule as a condition for independence, Smith's government declared independence unilaterally UDI in 1965.
Against Britain's wishes.
Completely. Despite UN condemnation, international sanctions, which were leaky because neighboring South Africa and Portuguese Mozambique propped them up, Smith's regime held on.
Leading to war.
Yes, a long, bitter guerrilla war fought by nationalist groups like Robert Mbabe's ZANU and Joshua Nkomo's ZAPU. By the late 1970s, the white regime was facing military defeat. That forced them to negotiate.
The Lancaster House Conference.
Exactly. In London in 1979, it hammered out a new constitution guaranteeing black majority rule. Mugabe's ZANU won the elections that followed, and Rhodesia finally became independent Zimbabwe in April 1980. A very long and bloody road.
Which brings us almost finally to South Africa. A unique case, you said. It already had dominion status way back.
Yes, since 1909. And its white population, predominantly Afrikaners of Dutch Boer descent, didn't have those same close ties to Britain as settlers in, say, Rhodesia or Kenya. Their trajectory was different.
How so?
While most colonies eventually gained independence under black majority rule and stayed in the Commonwealth, South Africa did the opposite. It entrenched white minority rule and left the Commonwealth in 1961.
Driven by the policy of apartheid.
Precisely. The Afrikaner nationalists won the election in 1948 on a platform of rescuing whites from the Black Menace. They immediately began implementing apartheid total segregation.
Can we really grasp how pervasive apartheid was, how systematic?
It's hard to overstate. It governed every aspect of life. Africans forced into separate reserves, Bantustans, or segregated townships with vastly inferior services, forcibly relocated if needed, separate buses, hospitals, beaches, schools, even separate park benches and church entrances.
Everything divided by race.
Everything. People were legally classified by race. Interracial marriage or relationships were illegal. And black Africans, the vast majority, had absolutely no political rights in white South Africa.
The world reacted negatively, presumably. You mentioned Macmillan's speech there.
Yes, international criticism grew steadily. Macmillan's Wind of Change speech, warning them directly in their own parliament, was incredibly brave, but ultimately ignored by the hardline government. Then came the Sharpeville Massacre in 1960, police killing 67 unarmed African protesters. That horrified the world.
And led to leaving the Commonwealth.
The criticism became so intense, especially at the 1961 Commonwealth Conference, that South Africa's Prime Minister Verwoerd withdrew their application to remain a member after becoming a republic. They were effectively isolated within the Commonwealth structure.
But apartheid itself persisted for decades after that. What finally broke it?
It was a long struggle. Crucially, the geopolitical map changed. When Portugal's empire collapsed in 1975, Mozambique and Angola gained independence. Then Zimbabwe in 1980. Suddenly, South Africa was surrounded by hostile black-ruled states supporting the anti-apartheid struggle.
External pressure mounted.
Massively. That, combined with ever-increasing internal resistance strikes, protests, the armed struggle, international sanctions starting to bite, eventually forced change from within the Afrikaner leadership. Moderates gained ground.
When did the big changes happen?
In the late 80s and early 90s, much of the petty apartheid legislation was scrapped. Then the real breakthrough in 1990, the ANC was unbanned, and Nelson Mandela was released after 27 years.
A truly iconic moment.
Absolutely. And huge credit has to go to President F.W. de Klerk, the Afrikaner leader who took the courageous steps, working with Mandela, to negotiate a new non-racial constitution. That was agreed in 1993.
Leading to the first democratic elections.
Yes. In May 1994, Nelson Mandela became South Africa's first black president. An astonishingly peaceful transition, considering the decades of brutal oppression. A real beacon of hope.
So looking back at this whole vast process, the end of this massive empire, what's the verdict? Was it, on balance, a good thing or a bad thing? It sounds like historians are still arguing fiercely about it.
Oh, absolutely. The debate over the legacy is intense and ongoing. You get totally opposing views. Some argue Britain should apologize for the sins of empire, citing slavery, exploitation, violence. Tony Blair expressed deep sorrow over slavery.
But others disagree.
Strongly. Gordon Brown, Blair's successor, famously said the days of Britain having to apologize for its colonial history are over and Britain should be proud of aspects of it. So, yeah, deeply contentious.
Okay, let's try to separate the arguments. What's on the debit side? The main criticisms.
Well, critics have been around since the empire itself. People like J.A. Hobson saw it as a capitalist conspiracy, basically theft. George Orwell was deeply critical. Bertrand Russell called it a cesspool for British moral refuse, pointing to racism and cruelty.
And there's evidence for this.
Sadly, yes, plenty. Arrogance, systemic racism, massacres of indigenous people in Australia and New Zealand, brutal subjugation campaigns, concentration camps in the Boer War, atrocities like Amritsar in India, those Kenyan detention camps we discussed.
A Bengal famine too?
A terrible example, 1943-44. Millions died, and Churchill's government refused to divert enough shipping for famine relief, with Churchill himself reportedly making callous remarks about Indians breeding. It's a very dark stain.
What about the economic legacy? Did Britain develop its colonies?
That's another major criticism. Many territories were left economically underdeveloped, often reliant on exporting just one raw material. Very little industry, poor infrastructure. Malawi, as an example, at independence had just 2 secondary schools for 2 million Africans, barely any roads, no factories.
So, not prepared for independence.
Often inadequately prepared, critics argue, both economically and politically. Democratic institutions were often fragile. And the borders. The borders were often drawn arbitrarily by Europeans back in the 19th century, cutting across ethnic groups, lumping rivals together. This sowed the seeds for future conflict, like in Nigeria or Rwanda. Piers Brendan's conclusion is stark. The empire was in grave moral deficit, echoing Gibbon's line about empires and human misery.
A powerful indictment. But there is a credit side, argued by some. What are the arguments for the empire, or at least acknowledging some positives?
Yes, there are counter-arguments. Supporters, going back to figures like Edmund Burke, saw empire as a trust, a duty to govern well, protect people, and eventually lead them to self-rule. Lloyd George claimed liberty was its principle.
And did administrators try to do good?
Many certainly believed they were, and sincerely tried. They worked to abolish slavery, practices like thuggee and sati in India, cannibalism in some areas. Lord Curzon genuinely aimed to give India efficient, modern administration, improving railways, irrigation, justice, education.
And modern defenders, like Neil Ferguson.
Ferguson makes a strong case for some positive legacies. He highlights what he sees as the positive influence of British law, administration, and economic structures. He even argues there was a strong internal liberal critique within Britain that made the empire self-liquidating, destined to end itself.
What specific benefits does he point to?
He lists things like the spread of capitalism, which he sees positively, the Anglicization of North America and Australasia, English becoming a global language, the influence of Protestantism, and importantly, the survival of parliamentary democracy against fascism and communism in the 20th century.
Quite a list.
He argues Britain built global communication networks, spread law and order, and even controversially claims it maintained a global peace unmatched before or since. His conclusion is provocative. Empire can work as a form of international governance.
Very different perspectives. Finally, let's bring it back to Britain itself. What did losing this vast empire actually mean for Britain? Did its power and prestige collapse?
It's interesting. Some historians, like Jeremy Black, argued decolonization wasn't actually that central to British domestic politics. Once Britain got the H-bomb, colonies seemed less vital for defense, maybe? Bernard Porter suggests the empire just wasn't that important in the daily lives of most Britons. They were hardly aware of it.
So losing it wasn't a huge trauma for the average person?
Apparently not. By the late 20th century, imperialism had become widely seen as a bad thing anyway. And once India was gone, as George L. Bernstein argues, the rest of the empire was maybe irrelevant to British power and financially impossible to defend. Losing it, he suggests, actually freed Britain from a huge burden, allowing it to pursue its real national interests.
And the transition was smoothed over by framing it positively.
Definitely. Presenting it as the fulfillment of Britain's mission, preparing colonies for self-government, transforming empire into their friendly commonwealth. That helped manage the narrative.
So, for the British public.
As Porter says, there was no great outburst of despair. It was just another of those marginal issues for most people. But, and Bernstein makes this crucial point, while Britons themselves might not have cared deeply, other countries saw the empire as the key symbol of Britain's global greatness.
Ah, the perception.
Exactly. Losing the empire, even if it freed up resources, meant others might not take the British as seriously in world affairs. And perhaps more importantly, he concludes, it meant that the British did not take themselves as seriously. A fundamental shift in national self-perception.
What a fascinating, complex, often painful story we've covered. The end of the British Empire, from that vast peak to its unraveling through so many different pressures and struggles.
It really underscores that decolonization was never simple, never one single story. It was this incredibly intricate tapestry: economics, politics, nationalism, ideology, and sadly, often immense human suffering all woven together. And the fact we're still debating its legacy so fiercely shows how powerfully it continues to resonate.
Absolutely. And that leads us, and you listening, with a thought to consider. How do these diverse, often conflicting accounts of the empire's end and its enduring contested legacy challenge or perhaps affirm your own understanding of global power, of national identity, and how we tell these crucial historical stories today?